Masechet Yevamot Daf Ayin Vav. A lot of interesting and important topics in Agadah here. We're going to start off with a little bit more of a discussion about the definitions of Pitzua Dakau, Chrut Shofcha, what types of injuries invalidate someone like that for marriage and which are okay, and one that can actually be healed. And then we're going to be speaking about the next Mishnah, which is who can a Pitzua Dakah actually marry? That'll involve a fascinating discussion about Shlomo, King Shlomo, and his wives. And then we'll get to the next Mishnah, which is about marrying an Ammoni and Moabi. And that will get into a fantastic Agadah about David HaMelech and his lineage from Ruth HaMoaviyah. Okay, so we begin. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shemuel Nikab v'nistam kol shilu nikre v'nikra pasul. If someone had a puncture in his member, but it closed up, the hole closed up. Well, how is that okay? Does it go back to being able to marry into the community? Well, it depends. We have to test him to see if he should have an emission. And because of that emission, the hole opens up again, tears open, then it's no good. It's not really closed sufficiently. But if he has an emission and it remains closed, then yes, he is kosher and now he can marry. Rava asked about this statement of Shemuel, where exactly is this hole? If it's below the corona, meaning towards the tip, then even if the tip is cut off, it's still kosher, so he still can marry. So therefore, for sure, if there's only a hole, so that can't be what Shemuel was talking about. Ela bataratzma, rather, must be talking about on the corona itself. That's where the hole is, and so there it does make a difference whether it has to be closed up and has to be closed up in a permanent way. Itemar name, Amar Amari bar Mor, Amar Mor Ukba, Amar Shemuel. We have another statement that backs up everything we just said. Nikab ba'atanatzma v'nistam. If it was the hole in the corona itself and it closed up, kol shu nikre v'nikra pasul v'ilav kasher. If he has an emission and it opens up again, then the person cannot marry into the kahal, into the regular community of Jews. But if it remains closed, then he's kosher. Good. Shalach le Rava bered Rava le Rav Yosef. Ilamedenu Rabenu hechi abdinan. And now a practical question of how to do this test. You see, we can't allow him to marry and then see, when you're with your wife, does it open up or not? Because the question is he allowed to marry in the first place or not? So we need to simulate an emission in order to test to see if this hole will remain closed or not. So Rava asks Rav Yosef, how exactly do you do this? So the problem is that a man is not allowed to stimulate himself directly. So how can we cause him to have an emission, but without him touching himself directly? So the answer is bring some warm barley bread and put it under him, and that will get him excited, and then that could be the test, and we can check him. All right, so that's his answer, Rav Yosef's answer. Amar Abaye, atuku le'alma Yaakov Avinu havai dichtiv be kochi v'reshit oni shelo ra'a keri miyamav. Abaye is wondrous about this. This seems like an extreme measure, right? Does everyone need such a big deal in order to have an emission? Is everybody like Yaakov Avinu? Regarding him, it says about Reuven that Reuven is his first fruit of his strength, and the rabbis learned from that he never had an emission in his life before he conceived Reuven. In other words, he was able to control his desires a lot. So is everybody like him, like a monk, that they have such low hormones that they would need this extreme measure in order to get them excited? Most people don't need that. They can get excited without such strong stimulation. That's what Abaye says. Ela Abaye says a simpler way. You don't have to go and bring this bread and put it under him. Rather, we could just get some colorful women's clothing. It seems most of the time that men wore white, women wore colors. So bring some, do a fashion show. Bring some, not people, just the clothing. Pass it in front of him, and so maybe some lingerie. And that will get the person excited, and that's sufficient. Amar Rava, atuko le'alma barzilai agil hadihu. Rava says, no, that's not enough. That's too little. Most people cannot get excited just from looking at something. Looking at clothing. So his example is everybody as excitable as Barzilai Hagil Adi, who was known for being very licentious and easily aroused. So not everybody's like that. So in other words, it's too little. No, so first is too much, then is too little. Ela machvarta ketemei karad. Rava says, no, what the better, what we said before. For most people, the barley trick is what's needed. All right, Tenora Banan, Nikav Pasur Mipnei Shehu Shotet. And we have a Braita now that says if there is a hole, a puncture, the reason it's unfit is because then the emission comes out gently and a woman cannot conceive in that way. Nistam kasher, but if the hole closes up, then a person goes back to becoming kosher, Mipnei Shemolid, because once the hole in the member is closed, then he can have a normal emission. This is a good example of something that will cause someone to be unfit, but once it heals, he can go back to being kosher and being able to marry. So now it says, that's the end of the Braita. We analyze. It says the word zehu, which seems to indicate that it's limiting this case as opposed to some other case. So zeh limut hemai, what is it excluding? Limute kerum she'ala mehamat makah bare'ah de'eno kerum. So this type of healing, like some kind of scab over this hole, that's okay for regarding a person who is no longer is a pesua daka. But the case we're excluding is lungs of an animal. If an animal's lung has a hole in it, then it's terefa. It cannot live long like that. It's not kosher. But if it heals with a membrane over it, some kind of scab over it, is that considered healed? And now now the animal is kosher again? Or not? So we're excluding that case. In other words, that animal is not kosher. Okay, good. This is related to the laws of glatt kosher, that the lung, how smooth does the lung have to be? When does a hole that's healed, is that considered full healing and it's now it's a healthy animal, or is it still a terefa? Shalach le Rav Idi bar Abin Abaye Hechi Abdinan Maitinan se'arta u'misartinan le u'maitinan tarba v'shayfinan. Okay, a little bit graphic, but very interesting. So if someone does have a hole, what can we do to help them heal? So here's some surgery, some medical advice. Here's what you should do. You should bring a piece of barley, a grain of barley, and scratch the area around the hole to make it bleed, kind of reopen the wound, so that it'll be able to close up afterwards. And we put some fat, we bring some fat and rub it around. That will be like a kind of glue. We bring an ant, the shum shena is an ant, gamla, a large ant, and we let the ant start biting inside the hole, and that way its teeth will will attach themselves to him, to the area. And then we cut off the ant's head and we leave the ant inside, and that way, once as the ant head decays, the flesh will regrow and will connect to itself, and this is the ancient version of stitches. I would bet that this actually worked, but we can check the medical literature to see how widespread, if this was a widespread practice. Okay, vedavka se'arta. Make sure to only use a barley grain in order to scratch open the wound. Aval parzela mizraf saref. But don't use a metal tool, because that will cause inflammation, right? You just want to kind of, maybe because it wasn't, had germs on it, whereas a grain, you just go and, pluck out, and it wasn't used for a previous surgery. They didn't know how to clean it, or maybe because you don't want to actually cause like new cuts, you just want to scratch it open a bit. But this procedure will only work for a small hole. It will not work for a large hole. All right, fascinating. Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna hamatil mayim mishete mekomot pasul. If someone passes water, meaning urinates from two different places, then that person is also called kerut shofcha and will not be able to bear children, and so therefore cannot marry. Amar Rabba le tilchata lo kibra velo ke'aba. But Rava disagrees and says the halacha is not like the son and not like the father. The son is what we just said. Amaran, it's Rabba, the son of Rav Huna. So we do not follow that halacha. And Abba, what does Rav Huna say that we don't follow? If two women rub themselves against each other, then they, according to Rav Huna, they can no longer marry a kohen. So, in other words, they have the title, they'll get the attribution of zonah and cannot marry a kohen. Okay, so that's what Rav Huna says, and Rava says that is not the halacha. And Rava continues and says, "Va'afilu Rabbi Elazar damar panui haba ala penuya shelo l'shem ishut asa azona." And he says, even according to Rabbi Elazar, if you remember, we had about 5 different definitions of what a zonah is. And Rabbi Elazar was the most expansive definition, who said that a zonah is called even if you have a single man and a single woman who have bi'ah together, even though they are permitted to each other. So they're not violating any biblical law. Nevertheless, if they do it not for the purposes of marriage, but just for the purposes of pleasure, then that is called a zonah. Any extramarital relations will cause a woman to become a zonah, and therefore prohibited from marrying a kohen. We don't follow that as the halacha, but even according to that most expansive definition, Rabbi Elazar would agree, hanemile ish, that's only if it's a man and a woman, because there is an act of penetration. Aval isha perisuta be'alma. But if it's two women, then there is no act that can be defined as bi'ah. And therefore, we cannot say that she is a zonah. There is no act that we can call that. Rather, it's simply licentiousness, which does not make her a zonah. And so, therefore, even according to Rabbi Elazar, no, we disagree with Rav Huna. She would not be a zonah. And that is, Rambam codifies this as a halacha l'maaseh that says that there's no midoraita, there's no prohibition for two women. However, it is a dirabanan, and he has some harsh words to say about women who engage in such activity. All right, next Mishnah. Pitzua daka uchurut shofcha mutarin begiyoret umeshuchreret ve'enan asurin ella milavo bakahal. Okay, pitzua daka. Now that we defined the term, and they cannot marry a regular person who's born Jewish and is fit, but they can marry a convert, or Eved Kanani, Shifcha Kanani, who was freed, was equivalent to a convert. Okay, and they are only not allowed to marry kahal, meaning someone who's born Jewish, because it says people with these injuries cannot come to, meaning marry, kahal Hashem, only the congregation, and the congregation does not include convert. I mean, converts are Jewish for all matters, but halachic matters, but they're still not kahal Hashem, and so therefore that different status does allow them to marry a pitzua daka. All right, that's the Mishnah. Question. Ba'u mine merav sheshat pitzua daka kohen mahu begiyoret umeshuchreret. So if you have someone who has such an injury and he's a kohen, can that kohen marry a convert or a freed slave? Now, in general, a kohen cannot marry a giyoret, but since he is now pitzua daka, does he remain, does he keep his holy status, his sanctified status as a kohen, and so therefore cannot marry a giyoret? Ve'asir, or once he becomes a pitzua daka, he loses his sanctified status as a kohen, and therefore those marriage laws fall away, and he would be permitted to marry a giyoret, which would be helpful because he can't marry too many people. And so then that would be helpful for him to be able to marry a convert. That's the question. Does the pitzua daka kohen keep his status as a kohen? in terms of marriage or not. Okay, Amar lehu Rav Sheshet, they asked him the question, and he answers, Tini tuha, oh, I have a source, I can answer your question based on a baraita. Then in fact he loses his status, because Pesua Daka Yisrael Mutar Benetina. He's doing it by analogy. A regular Yisrael who has such an injury is permitted to marry a Nitina. That's a descendant of the Gibeonites who were Canaanim, and they tricked Yoshua to convert, and so they did convert, but they originally Canaanim. Now, okay, this is an interesting analogy. What we're doing is we're analogizing a Kohen marrying Gioret to a Yisrael marrying one of the 7 nations in Canaan. So Bikdushateh here is not regarding a Kohen sanctification, but sanctification as a Jew. There is an analogy, right? Just like Kohanim are the sanctified group among Israel, so too Israel is Mamlechet Kohanim compared to other nations. And so if we say that a Pesua Daka can marry someone from the 7 nations, well, how could that be? Pasuk says we are not allowed to marry any of the 7 nations that are in Canaan. And the Nitinim are converts who were originally Canaanim. And so yet you're allowed to marry. So how could this be? If you think that because he's a Pesua Daka. So you see that because if Yisrael becomes a Pesua Daka, he loses his status as sanctified as a Jew. I mean, he remains a Jew for other matters, for all of the matters. But the point is, Pesua Daka for marriage laws is no longer sanctified, and therefore is permitted to marry a Canaani, and therefore is permitted to marry a Natin, who converted. So that's his proof. This is assuming that the prohibition of lo titchaten bam applies even when a Canaanite converts. They can convert, right? They could go do the Brit Milah and Mikveh and all that. But even if they convert, that's specifically where the prohibition is. Nevertheless, you cannot marry them. So a regular Jew cannot marry, but a Pesua Daka Jew can marry, means he loses his Kedusha. And by analogy, a Kohen who's Pesua Daka also loses his Kedusha status in terms of marriage, and therefore would be able to marry a Giyoret. Okay, pretty brilliant parallel that Rav Sheshet has, and we're going to uphold it, but not before a serious question. Amar Rava, Atu hatam mishum kedusha velav kedushahu. Rava says, is that the reason why a Pesua Daka can marry a Natin, because he loses his status, and if he's not Pesua Daka, then he has kedusha? Is that the factor there? I don't think so. Dilma molid ben ve'azil palach lavodah zara. Maybe the worry is regarding a child. If he goes v'hanemele b'giyutan, that's a significant line. According to Rava, the prohibition of lo titchaten bam does not apply biblically if the person converts, the Canaanite converts, but rather only if they are still not Jewish. So if someone would go and marry a Canaanite while they are not Jewish, then that's the biblical prohibition, because we're worried that they're going to go and have a child, and the child is going to grow up to be an idolater like his father. So that's the problem. That's why Torah says do not do that. But Kimei Gayere B'Israel Sharu. But if he converts, so now he's leaving away his idolatrous practice as part of the conversion practice. We tell him, listen, no more idolatry for you. So he converts, and then according to the Torah, he's permitted. So it's really interesting, right? According to Rav Sheshet, lo titchaten bam applies even after someone converts. According to Rava, only when they are still a Canaanite before they convert. That's when it applies biblical level. But then the rabbis came and they made a gezerah and said, even if they convert, still, you know what? Don't marry them. It's not a good idea. Who knows? Maybe they still have some idolatry and that they didn't totally get rid of, and still may be a bad influence. If they have a child and will teach the child idolatrous ways, maybe the child will be influenced by other family members. Okay, so therefore, midrabanan is no good. Now, when if you're going to make such a gezerah, you'd only make a gezerah for someone who can have a child. But a pesua daka who have an injury and they cannot bear children, there's no need to make a gezerah. What's going to happen? He's going to bring home he's going to have some idolatrous practice, even though he converted. Okay, it's not good, but there's no children, so he's not going to pass it on, and therefore, as the end of the line, we don't have to worry. So therefore, according to Rava, there is no proof from this. The reason why a pesua daka can marry a netinim did convert. It's true, it was under false pretenses, because they told Yeshua we're from far away, not from one of the 7 nations. Nevertheless, their conversion is a valid conversion, and so that's why a regular Israel cannot marry a natin, because of a gezerah d'Rabbanan. They converted, so it's not a Doraita problem. But a pesua daka is okay. The rabbis did not make a gezerah in such a case. So it has nothing to do with Kiddusha or losing Kiddusha. It's only about where the rabbis made a gezerah. Okay, now a small update to that law, to that explanation, but still the same conclusion. Now what about a mamzer marrying a natin? A mamzer can have a child. Physically, they're able to have children. So then would you say that a mamzer, according to your logic, should not be permitted to marry a natin because we'll worry about, he's a convert, but maybe he still has some idolatry, so midrabanan he may pass it on and teach his child, so a mamzer should be prohibited to a natin, according to your logic, Rava. But the Mishnah says that a mamzer and a natin are allowed to marry each other. So it can't be that the exemption for a pesua daka is just because he cannot have children from this gezerah. Rather, a small modification of Rava's answer, which is that the rabbis in general said the prohibition v'lo titchaten bam is only when they are not Jewish, if they don't convert. If they do convert, there's no problem with deoraita. The rabbis made a gezerah, but when they made their gezerah, they made it only for regular Jews that are kosher to marry. But anyone who is pasul to marry, pesua daka or mamzer, so since they're already a secondary character, secondary class, they are no gezerah regarding them. They can marry a natin. Okay, so nevertheless, even at this point, the Rava is bringing a serious challenge. It says it's not because of kiddusha or not kiddusha; it's rather because of idolatrous background. But after he thought about it, Hadar Amar Rava changed his mind. This is Lav Miltahi Begayutan Letehu Chatanut. What I said cannot be right because the pasuk says Lo titchaten bam. Do not marry them. But someone who's not Jewish cannot be married, right? If someone, a Jewish man goes and gives 100 rings to a non-Jewish woman, they're not married. There is no halachic validity to that action. So if it says lo titchaten bam, it says prohibited to marry, it implies that it's only talking about someone that you could make a valid marriage with. Therefore, the prohibition must be talking about a Canaanite who did convert. So in that case, if one does a marriage act, the marriage act is valid, and so they are married, but that's precisely where the prohibition is. So now, this revives Rav Sheshat's proof that if pesua daka, a regular Israel cannot marry natin. Pesua daka can marry a natin. You see that the whole biblical law drops out, doesn't apply to him, to a pesua daka, because he doesn't have that sanctification as a Jew that this prohibition would apply to. If that's true, then by analogy also, a kohen who normally cannot marry a georet, if he's a pesua daka, he loses his sanctification as a kohen in terms of marriage, and therefore pesua daka kohen is in fact permitted to marry a convert. Okay, very good. So now that we understand that, we have a new question. Mativ Rav Yosef, Vayitchaten Shlomo et bat Paro melech Mitzrayim. Okay, how could Shlomo marry the daughter of Paro from Egypt? After all, she is not. We just learned that there's no possibility of enacting a valid marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew. But it says here the word vayitchaten, so Shlomo did marry this foreigner. So how could that be? The answer is gayude gayira. Oh, he converted her first. She was an Egyptian, but he converted her. So then once you convert, you can do a good marriage. Hold on. We have a tradition that converts were not accepted during the time of David and Shlomo, because these were good times for the Jews, so everybody would want to come and convert for ulterior motives, because the economy was great. This was prestigious thing. Just like today, lots of people from various countries would love to be able to immigrate to Israel, become Jewish, and take part of the good economy there. But so we did not accept converts during those good times. So how was he able to convert this princess of Mitzrayim? The answer is midihu tama ela l'shulchan melachim ha lasricha le. No, the only reason why we didn't accept them at that time is because they have ulterior motives, that they want to come and be at the king's table. A phrase that means they want to have benefit from the materialism and power and good economy and be connected with this with them. But she was already a princess. She's an Egyptian princess, so she already has access to everything that one can ever need, to power and money and all that. And so therefore, the fact that she's not converting for Shlomo's money. She already has plenty. So if she's converting, then it must be that she is converting for valid reasons, and that's why she was allowed to convert. Okay, this is actually a very important argument because it applies, poskim, many poskim have applied it. Nowadays, most poskim even have applied it nowadays, where if there's a couple who are already living together, an intermarried couple, and now one of them wants to convert, even let's say they get married, they were married civilly or had children or so on. And so now one comes and says, oh, you know what, I want to convert. So generally we say, no, you can't convert, you're converting for ulterior motives, so it's only for marriage. But since nowadays you can live in a secular society without converting, and there's no government, no law against it. So if the person's converting, it's not for marriage because they're already living together and having a family. If they're converting nowadays, it must be because that they are actually sincere, that they do want to be Jewish. So this would be a good precedent for that argument. We now bring a further problem with King Shlomo marrying this Egyptian princess. It's not sufficient to say that he converted her because we know the law is that one is not permitted to marry a first generation or even second generation convert from Egyptians. Pasuk says, so don't hate an Egyptian because we were immigrants in their land. Rather, their children that they will give birth to only after in the third generation, then one can marry into an Egyptian convert family. With first generation has to convert, they can marry other people who are unfit, other converts, for example, and they can have a child with them. And after third generation of since the grandparent who converted, then they can marry into the kahal. In this case, the princess was the convert herself. And so even if she did convert, and we accept it, nevertheless, Shlomo is not allowed to marry her. So what are we going to do with that problem? Okay, maybe you'll say that the original Egyptians that the Torah was talking about, we don't know where they went. And these people who happen to live in Egypt are different people. The original Egyptians, maybe they were killed in Yam Suf, in the Makot, or people move around. This is actually before Sancheriv. The Assyrians came and moved everyone around in 722. But this is talking about King Shlomo, who lived in the 930 around. So this is before that. But nevertheless, this is still a good 300 years after Yetziat Mitzrayim. So maybe it's not the same people, and the prohibition does not apply to the current Egyptian population, but you cannot say that. V'hatanya amar Rabbi Yehuda min yamin ger mitzri hayali haver mitalmidei Rabbi Akiva. This is a fascinating testimony that Rabbi Yehuda says there was a guy named Min Yamin, and he was a convert from Egyptians. And he was my friend. And he was a student of Rabbi Akiva. So it was way later in the times of the Tanaim. Now, how did he come to join this Jewish community here? He had a system. Amar ani misri rishon. Listen, I'm converting now, but he's a Tamid Chacham. He's he's a student of Rabbi Akiva. He knows his Gemara, Mishnah, and all that. So v'nasati misrit rishona. So he will marry another Egyptian convert. Good, two Egyptians. They both convert, marry each other. Permitted. They'll have a son. He didn't do this yet, but this was his plan. This is his plan. And he'll have a son who will be second generation convert. And I'll marry him off to another Egyptian convert, second generation. And then my grandson will be from his mother and from his father already a third generation convert and will be able to marry just fine. Okay, what we see here is that even during the later time of Rabbi Akiva, even after Sancheriv came and mixed up all the populations, nevertheless, they were still they still considered the people that live in Egypt to be the indigenous population that the prohibition of the Torah applies to. So you can't tell me that we don't have to worry that these are not the original Egyptians anymore. So, question, how could Shlomo possibly marry an Egyptian princess, even if he converted her? Still wouldn't be good. Amar Papa, Anan Mishlomo leku v'netev. The Papa says this whole line of thinking is not necessary. This whole question is not necessary. The question was back on Rava. How could you say that there's no marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew? That was his assumption. But look, Shlomo says married and an Egyptian. No, don't bring Shlomo as a proof at all. Shlomo lo nasa midi. Shlomo did not actually marry halachically any of these foreign wives. Tichtiv. Min hagoyim asher amar Hashem el bnei Israel lo tavou bahem vehem lo yavou bachem achen yatu et lebabchem acharei Elohehem bahem dabak Shlomo le'ahava. This is a pasuk that's criticizing King Shlomo, and it says from all of the nations that Hashem said in Sefer Devarim that Bnei Israel should not marry them, and they should not marry their daughters, and their sons should not marry our daughters. All those people, because we're afraid, because they will divert our minds towards idolatry after their idols. They were the people that Shlomo clung to in love. So you see, this pasuk does not say that they married. It just says he went and he fell in love with them, and he took them into his palace. But it doesn't actually say he married any of them, and so therefore there's no problem. He did not actually halachically marry anyone. You don't have to say they converted. It doesn't matter. The Egyptians, he was not allowed to take her no matter what. He just violated, and there was no halachic marriage. Okay, hold on. But regarding the Egyptian princesses, does say the word veitchaten. Doesn't that mean that there was a valid marriage, legally, not that even if it was prohibited, but that the marriage that took effect? No. Rather, it's just using marriage as a general expression, because he loved these women so much. He loved her so much that it considers it like marriage. Like we use it today, the term intermarriage, even though halachically a man and a Jewish man and non-Jewish woman, or the other way around, they are not married according to halacha, even if they're married civilly, but we still call it intermarriage, right? So because they are together. So here, this is just a way of describing Shlomo, who was with these women, and there was no halachic marriage. In fact, so forget the whole line of thinking regarding Shlomo. Okay, and now new thing, just last point on this very Mishnah. Amar Ravina Rav Asher, v'ha'anan tenan, pesua daka uchrut shofcha, mutarim begiyoret umeshuchreret, ha-benetina asire. Okay, this is a question on the Baraita that we've been discussing this whole time, that says a pesua daka is allowed to marry a natin. That's what the Baraita says. But our Mishnah only said that a Pesuat Akka is allowed to marry a convert and a freed Canaanite slave. It didn't say a Natin he's allowed to marry a Natina, so the Mishnah suggests that it's not allowed, and the Braita is going against the Mishnah. Rav Asher's answer is, Amar Lev Tamich Emasefa. Look at the ending of our Mishnah, the one that we just learned. It says, Ve'enan asurin ela milavo bakahal. Continues and says, Pesuat Akka can marry a Girot Meshuchreret, and they are not, the only people they're not allowed to marry is Bakahal, someone who's a Kahal. So that's all the Sefa says. So we can infer from the Sefa that they are only not allowed to marry someone who is in Kahal. Val b'netina sharu. Netina is permitted because that's the prohibition only applies to kahal. It does not apply in the tintina, so that would be permitted. So you see that the Mishnah is ambiguous. Has two clauses, but neither of them talk about netina. The people that they are allowed to marry, netina is not there. So that suggests that netina is not allowed. But the Sefa says only kahal is allowed. Is prohibited, but doesn't say anything about netina. So maybe netina is permitted. So this is in a gap between the Resha and the Sefa. So you know what? Actually, the Mishnah does not talk about netina at all because it's a curious case. She's converted, but from a long time ago, valid converts. So, but under false pretenses, we don't know what to do with it. So that's why the Baraita comes to fill in the gap. And there's no question from the Mishnah. Ela meha lekal mishma mina. There's nothing that we can learn from the Mishnah about this, so we can accept that Baraita. All right, fantastic. And now the final Mishnah for today. Amoni u'moavi asurim v'isuran isur olam. The pasuk regarding them, I'll read it. Says, Lo yavo amoni u'moavi b'kal Hashem. Gam dor asiri lo yavo lahem b'kal Adonai ad olam. Ammonite and Moabite are not allowed to enter the kahal, even 10 generations, forever, never allowed. Why? The pasuk says, when you're leaving Egypt on the way, they didn't come and offer you bread and water. And also, Bil'am ben Be'or mipetor Aram Naharaim lekaleleka, that Balak, the king of Moab, hired Bil'am to curse the Jews. So therefore, that's the second reason that would apply to Moab, although not to Ammon. But both of these nations did not help out the Jews when they were in need on their way. Okay, so that's the prohibition. V'isuran asur olam, and it's forever. Aval nekevotehem mutarot miyad, but this prohibition only applies to the males of Ammon and Moab, and the females are permitted. Even that first generation of Ammonite or Moabite converts, permitted immediately. Okay. Misri v'adomi anam asurim ela ad shelosha dorot echad zecharim v'echad nekevot. Regarding Egyptians and Edomites, they are in one way more lenient and one other way more stringent. They are prohibited only for 2 generations. The third generation permitted to marry, so that's in the way it's more lenient. But the prohibition for those 2 generations applies to both males and females. That's Tanakama. That's the normal opinion. However, there's a disagreement. Rabbi Shimon matir et nekevot miyad. He says Misri and Adomi are more lenient in all matters, and a female convert from Egyptians and Edomites is allowed to marry even the first generation. Amar Rabbi Shimon, what's his argument? Kavachomer devarim. I have a simple kavachomer. Umayim b'makom she'asur asar et zecharim isur olam. He tiret nekevot miyad. If in a case, meaning Moabites, Ammonites, Moabites, that the males are prohibited forever, so that's very stringent, and yet females are permitted even first generation. Makom shelo aseret hazecharim ela ad shelosha derot eno din shenatir tenekvot miyad. Then, in the case of Edomites and Egyptians, where the prohibition on is only for males, only up to the third generation, so it's more lenient than Moabite. So all the more so, we should permit the females immediately, right? If females from Moab, that's stringent, are permitted immediately, then females from the Egyptians, where it's more lenient, should certainly be permitted immediately. Okay, this makes sense as kal vachomer. Amru lo im halacha nekabel. But the sages told them, listen, if you have a tradition regarding this, we will accept your tradition because, okay, a tradition is valid from the oral law. Vim ladin yesh teshuvah. But if it's only based on your reasoning, we could argue with your reasoning. There's a problem with your logic. So I'm not accepting your kal vachomer, right? So do you have a tradition about it, and then you just came up with your own kal vachomer to back it up? Or is your halacha only based on logic? Malem lo ki halacha ni omer. He says, no, I have actually halacha, and the kal vachomer is just incidental. So, okay, they have to accept it. Doesn't mean that they agreed with him as a halacha, but they accepted that this is a valid argument. All right, that's the Mishnah. Now, question: how do we know that males are prohibited, but female from Ammon and Moab are permitted? אמר רבי יוחנן דאמר קרא וחירות שאול את דוד יוסד לקראת הפלישתי אמר אל אבנר שר סבא בן מי זה הנער אבנר ואמר אבנר חי נפשך המלך אם ידעתי. So we're going to learn it from the following story. Rabbi Yochanan says that this is when the Pelishtim came and they were fighting with Israel, and you had Goliath. Goliath was cursing and said, who's going to come and challenge me? And so David, who was only a little kid, and he just came to bring food to his older brothers who were fighting, and David said, okay, I'm going to go fight. Now, when Shaul saw that David was going and confronting the Pelishti Goliath, he said to Avner, his chief of the military, whose son is this? Avner. And Avner said, I don't know. Right? He said, I swear, I don't know. Now, that's the pasuk. We ask, Velo yadale, did he not know? How could it be? Previously, it says that Shaul loved David, and he became his arms bearer. So obviously he recognized him. He knew who this person was. Ela abu kamashil. Rather, when he asked Ben Mize, says, "Yeah, I know this young man David. He's my arms bearer. Yeah, I like him a lot. But I never found out what his lineage is. I want to know, where does he come from? Who is his father?" Okay, so that's the answer. Now, but even that, Vaviv lo yadale, is it possible that Shaul did not know who the father of David was? Vaketiv haish bimei Shaul zaken baba nashim. Regarding Yishai, David's father says he was in the days of Shaul, he was already old, and he was popular among the people. This is referring to Yishai, this man, and he would enter with multitudes and go out with multitudes, and he had a whole group, a whole following, because he was so important. He had a whole posse that followed him. So he's a famous person. So Shaul must have known who Yishai is, David's father. So what is he asking? Rather, this question was to his general. Which line is he from? Shaul knew he's from the line of Yehuda, but Yehuda and Tamar, they had two boys, Peres and Zerach. So which one is he from? Why does it make a difference? Imi Peres ate Malkahave. If he's from Peretz, then he is destined to be a king. We know the king is going to come from Shevet Yehuda. It says Lo Yasur Shevet Yehuda. Yehuda is going to have the staff of a king. But it depends which line. If he's from Peretz, then he'll be the king, because a king, his way is that he can go and make a breach, he can go do whatever he wants. No one can stop a king. So Peretz means kingship. Zerach means he'll shine, so he'll be an important person, but not a king. So I need to know, is he from the lineage of Yehuda that's going to be a king, and therefore going to challenge me, Shaul, who was the king so far. Okay, my tama amar le she'al ale. Now, what prompted him to ask at this point in time? A simple answer would be, he's about to confront Goliath. If he wins, he'll be a hero, and everybody will want to make him king. He actually offered his own daughter to whoever kills Goliath. Okay, but the Gemara is going to answer from the context right there. It says, Dichtiv, Vayalbesh Shaul et David madav. Shaul gave David his apparel, his armor. his own armor. He put on David to go and confront Goliath. It says Madav ke midato, meaning it was his own size. It fit him perfectly. How could that be? Shaul was taller than everybody, and David, he's a boy. How could this big armor fit this little kid? So look, it fits. It's like miraculously he grew in stature, and so that prompted him to say, "How could this fit on him?" Okay, maybe also he saw him in his own armor, in the royal armor. He's like, "Oh boy, this guy looks good in the armor. Is he going to be king?" So Doeg Adomi, he's always the troublemaker. He says, "Don't worry about this, David. Before you ask whether he's fit to be king or not, ask if he can even marry within the community." Why? Go look where he comes from. His lineage is from Ruth, the Moabite. And you're not allowed to marry a Moabite for even more than 10 generations. So forget being king. You can't even marry a regular person. Amar Avner, Tanena, Amoni, velo Moabit. Avner says, wait, we have a Braita. This is fantastic, right? Go back in the times of Avner, and he knows this Braita. And they're having a serious halachic discussion. It says, the Midrash says, Amoni, male specifically, but female Ammonit is permitted. Moavi, velo Moavit. You're only not allowed to marry a Moavi convert, but a Moavit is permitted, and Ruth is female, so therefore it's no problem. So now Doeg continues. He's Tamid Chacham, he knows his stuff. Elamata mamzer velo mamzeret. If you're going to say that everything here means male and not female, only males are prohibited. So you're going to say also when it says in this context, mamzer is not allowed, but mamzeret, the female, is permitted to marry? He says, no. Mamzer kitib mumzar. Mamzer stands for two words. It's someone has a strange blemish, meaning they're the result of some forbidden relation. Anyone who's the result, sons and daughters alike, from prohibited relation is going to be a mamzer, so therefore it doesn't make sense to say only men and not women. So that's why it doesn't apply there. Okay, Doeg goes back. Misri velo misrit. Are you going to say also that only a male Egyptian convert is not allowed, but a female is permitted? No, shane achad mefaresh tama dikra ala shelo kedemu etchem balechem abamayim darko shel ish lekadem velo darka shel isha lekadem. So we can answer Doeg and say, no, we're only applying this male but not female to Moabites and Ammonites, because the pasuk gives the reason we cannot marry them, because they did not come and give us bread and water while Bnei Israel was on the way. Now, who would come and give them bread and water? It would be the men who would go forth and confront them. That would be weird if the women were coming and confronting this whole nation, right? The men are going to be the ones that are going to be the messengers to bring the food and the water, right? It's the way of men, but not the way of women, and therefore the women didn't do anything wrong, so you're allowed to marry them. It's the men who should have and didn't help out Bnei Israel. So he answers. Doeg says, no, not true. Haya lehem lekadem anashim likrat anashim v'nashim likrat nashim. No, the Moabites should have sent the men to go and help out the men, and they should have sent their Moabite women to go and help the Bnei Israelite woman. More appropriate, right? That the men should be serving the woman. And so the woman should have also come out and helped this nation, this poor nation that was traveling in the desert with no food. So they also, in fact, should be prohibited. Ishtik. Avner had no answer. Doeg Adomi had these really good questions. Okay, while witnessing all that, King Shaul is standing by, and he's still worried. He doesn't know the answer. Is this person David? What's his lineage? Is he fit to marry to Kahal or not? Is he from the lineage of the king or not? So miyad v'yomer HaMelech she'al ata ben mi zeh ha'alem. So he goes and asks, go and ask, well, who is this youth? Now notice, he used a different word. Before, hatam karele na'ar, v'hacha karele ailem. Before he called him na'ar, now he calls him elim, a different word. So why does he have a different word? Hachi ka'amar le. This is what Shaul said to Doeg, halachanit alema mimecha, se ushal bebet hamidrash. Says, oh, we forgot the law in this case, right? We don't know. Is it applied to men or young? You're arguing back and forth, Doeg and Avner, but you don't have a conclusion, and Avner, you didn't have an answer. You're you know what, we better go ask the Bet Midrash and clarify this point, because we want to know if this David, if he is from Ruth, so if she's prohibited, then we don't have to worry about him, because he's not even legitimate, he can't even marry. So go ask the Bet Midrash. Shal, Amru le, Amoni velo Amonit, Moabi velo Moabit. And Bet Midrash said, no, in fact, it only applies to the males, but the females are permitted. And therefore, David HaMelech is permitted to, from a permitted line, he's permitted to marry into the Jewish people. No problem there. And so there you go. That's our answer to our original question, which was, and the Mishnah said, Moabi velo Moabit. How do we know this? The answer is, we know this from this long derivation. We can shorten it to say, well, David HaMelech came from Ruth, so therefore it must be that it is allowed. All right, this Agadah goes on for a bit more, and we'll see the continuation tomorrow.